Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features or ideas on how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Hello, compañeros, and welcome to episode 88. How are you today, Steve?
I'm doing great today. This is an exciting episode for me. Episode 88 on SharePoint.
Yes.
I know. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of SharePoint, but the information that we've got here is incredibly valuable as in the DBA role. So that's what gets me excited about it.
That's right. If your ears haven't started bleeding yet, we will mention that S word a few more times, as that is our topic today. But as Steve mentioned, lots of good stuff. Our guest today is Todd Klindt. It won't take too many SharePoint searches for his name to pop up. He's well-known and established in the SharePoint community, has his own blog. He's been doing live sessions, if you will, for over 3 years now. So excited to have him and kind of talk about that idea, the push and shove, if you will, that we as DBAs have with SharePoint and why sometimes it seems like we're not quite all talking on from the same sheet there.
Yep, exactly. So do we have any listener mentions?
We do. So Shane O'Neill was nice enough to reach out and chat with us. He's been listening to the show and said something that I thought was quite funny because we had not spoken before. And he said, so Carlos, I've been listening to the show. I enjoy it, but I've got a bit of a Morgan Freeman problem with your name. I can't read it without sounding like your voice from the podcast. To that, Shane, I say better than my face popping out at you and giving you nightmares in your sleep. But thanks for listening to the show, and we appreciate the feedback.
Yeah, I guess I'd really like to hear what that sounds like when he says your name. Maybe he can leave a message on the SQL Data Partners website with a recording of that.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yes, we still haven't, the infamous recording that we've been asking people for, but still haven't gotten. So it must not be everyone's favorite thing.
And then we had another mention, I think, from Claudio Silva.
So the other thing that's not people's favorite is waiting on episodes. So we had a great conversation that will be coming out later, actually next month, with the DBA Tools team. And he asked us, so when is that going to air? And we told him it was going to be a couple of weeks. And he said, a whole month? Oh, I can't believe I have to wait that long. And so thank you, Claudio, for your patience there. But that's just kind of the way that the interviews kind of worked out. And there is quite a process that we have to go through in order to get these out through editing and transcriptions and all of that other jazz.
Yep.
And so we appreciate your patience.
A little bit more detail on that. I can remember 4 or 5 months ago, there was a point in time where we were kind of scrambling to figure out who's going to be the guest for next week. And it really was just coming together and getting the podcast barely out the door in time. But now with a little bit of planning and guest lineup ahead of time, yeah, there is a little bit of a gap between when we record it. But the one thing that we do is we record and guest lineup ahead of time. Yeah, there is a little bit of a gap between when we record it. But the one thing that we do is we record the intro and the closing usually a couple days before the podcast goes out. So that's up-to-date information.
Right.
Whereas the podcast details, after we get past the intro, that's the part that's usually recorded ahead of time. Yeah.
And we have, we appreciate everybody tuning in. We have appreciated the feedback. The numbers continue to go up and more people are connecting. As Steve and I have talked a little bit about how we can continue to enjoy some of these interactions, because really with the podcast, it's an offline experience. We release every Wednesday, but you could be listening to it on Thursday or Friday, whenever. And sometimes people might listen to them in bunches, or they might be listening to them, once a week kind of a thing. So we've been looking at ways in which we can continue to engage with other folks. And we mentioned it a little bit on the podcast last this year on the East Coast. And we've affectionately called it the Compañero Conference.
Yes. And that's going to be a 2-day event.
Yes.
And it's going to be technical learning, but it's also going to have a lot of focus on the building the professional relationships so that
Exactly.
you know who to call when you need help, or you know when somebody's asking you for help, who they are. And I think that's one of those things that I experienced at Past Summit this last year, was getting to meet a handful of listeners and getting to know them a little bit. And I really enjoyed that. So I think getting to know more of the listeners and building more of a, I don't know if network's the right term, but more of a network of people that they can lean on when they need help. That's going to be a big part of the conference. So
that's right. So you do have to figure out how to spell compañero, but you can find more information at compañeroconference.com. And
when they need help, that's going to be a big part of the conference. So
that's right. So you do have to figure out how to spell compañero, but you can find more information at compañeroconference.com. And it'll be those 2 days. And we look forward to some feedback. Of course, the schedule is not yet posted. We are going to be reaching out to folks, kind of inviting them to be, leads, if you will, and giving some of these presentations. Of course, Steve and I will be talking as well. But if there's things that you would like us to talk about, of course, let us know that. I guess I should say, however, that our focus is going to be, I would say, what we're calling the accidental DBAs, the lone DBAs, or the DBAs that have SQL Server plus some other responsibility. So the focus won't necessarily be on all of the 2016 features, for example, but it will be, we want to include some of the older versions, kind of the backwards picture that they could have with features that they're not going to get for a couple more years.
Yep. And part of the reason, too, that we won't be announcing the schedule too early is we want to make sure that the schedule is up to date and timely at the time we get it out. And that's going to, and that event's going to be on October 4th and 5th.
Yep.
And
in Norfolk, Virginia.
Yep.
So
hope to see you there.
That's right.
Well, I know I'll see you there, Carlos, but hope to see the listeners there.
That's right. If it's just you and I, Steve, although we are on separate coasts and we do need to get together a little bit more often, it won't be too much of a conference. So now I think it's time for a little SQL Server in the news.
All right. Well, the news item that I came across this week is a new event from Microsoft called Microsoft Data Amp. It's a 1-day online seminar, I guess, and they say they put in AMP. It's a 1-day online seminar, I guess, and they describe it as putting data analytics and artificial intelligence into the heart of your solutions and getting the latest on big data and machine learning innovations. And that's going to be on April 19th at 8 a.m. Pacific time for the Microsoft Data Amp. And the keynote speakers on that are Scott Guthrie, the Executive Vice President at Microsoft and the Microsoft Cloud and Enterprise Group, and Joseph Soros, Corporate Vice President in the Data Group. So a lot of interesting information coming out from Microsoft in that event, I'm sure.
That's right. We see Joseph at a lot of the big events kind of representing the SQL Server and analytics space. And so it's interesting that they'll be putting this on. And ultimately, data science and analytics, is the new sexy right now and getting a lot of attention. But to Microsoft's credit, they are doing an making it and how we could potentially take advantage of it.
Yep. So I'll have to check my schedule and see if that's a day that I can check in and listen.
Yeah, check in. Yeah, I'm sure they'll record part of it, but again, some of that, the way they've been making announcements at Connect or Ignite and some of these other things, I'm sure there's bound to be some new release of something.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and jump into the conversation with Todd. The show notes for today's episode will be available at SQLDataPartners.com/SharePoint. So Todd, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Carlos.
Yes, it's a pleasure having you here. And when we reached out and chatted with you, I knew we were going to have a very interesting conversation. Ultimately, our conversation's about SharePoint today, but your response was, and we wanted to talk about the interactions between SharePoint and SQL Server. And your
Yeah.
response was, yes, I'd be happy.
Platform.
And your
Yeah.
response was, yes, I'd be happy to talk with you about the database lucky enough to host a SharePoint application.
Yes. Yes, there are many database platforms out there, but SQL is fortunate enough to be the one that gets to support SharePoint.
Yeah.
It's an honor above all honors. I hope SQL appreciates it.
Now, one thing you've said is that you've taught some classes in the past around this and around SQL for SharePoint admins and around the opposite of SharePoint for SQL DBAs.
Yeah.
And I think that's one that I think would be very exciting to our listeners in that there's a lot of DBAs that may not have the SharePoint experience.
So the way that worked is we've all heard the phrase, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And so when it comes to SharePoint DBAs, not SharePoint DBAs, SharePoint administrators, they need to know a bunch of things. They need to know SharePoint, obviously, but they also need to know IIS, and they need to know IIS, and they need to know PowerShell, and they need to know DNS and SQL. And of all of those things, SQL is the most complicated, the least forgiving, and just the most easiest screw up. And so I came in with a little bit of SQL knowledge, just a little bit more than the next guy, and so I became, one of these people. So when speaking at Tech Ed and things like that, I would speak about, for SharePoint administrators, the SQL part, and I would cover just the stuff that's just embarrassing to say in front of SQL folks, but SharePoint folks didn't know it. And so I had somebody, I can't remember what the event was, that we've got some SQL folks, they would like it the other way around. I'm like, absolutely, this is easy. And so I kind of twisted it on its head, and really what it ended up being was almost like a counseling session for SQL DBAs, because I was saying all these things that SharePoint was doing that they hated. And, like the ever popular using a GUID as a primary key, SQL DBAs love that. So it ended up being, here's all the ways, and, like the ever popular using a GUID as a primary key, SQL DBAs love that. So it ended up being, here's all the ways that SharePoint is going to try to destroy your SQL servers and all the things that it does wrong. And when I would teach the class to SharePoint administrators, I was almost like a god, because I just knew all these crazy things. Like I knew what a transaction log was and how to keep it from filling up my hard drives. To the SQL guys, I was just like the bearer of bad news. Yeah. I was just like, here's another thing that SharePoint's going to do that you're going to hate, and here's another thing.
Yeah.
So I think I only did that one once, and I just couldn't. It was hard on my ego. I couldn't take it.
When they got the pitchforks out, that's when you knew, like,
I knew that. About halfway through the session, they turned on me, and that was the moment. The pitchforks, and it was horrible.
Ultimately, I think we want to get into a little bit of that, right? We want to talk about, I have some questions about why SharePoint does the way things it does, and maybe you can help, shed some light there. Give us another opinion. And then, of course, the flip side is
the things that you're doing wrong. So, I hope somebody's got pen and paper. Yeah. It's like the whole episode, the thing on Family Guy, here's the stuff that grinds my gears. I've got all that. So I'm happy to oblige you.
Well, it's great to know that you can represent all of the SharePoint admins from that perspective.
We are one large homogeneous group, yes. Yep. And they've elected me as their spokesperson, so you're very lucky.
Okay, so the first thing, I guess, just to talk about, when we talk about SharePoint, we're talking about a couple of different databases.
Yeah.
And logging is probably the one that is going to get the most attention, only because it's so easy for that thing to get so big so quickly. Fair?
Yeah, there are a lot of ways that SharePoint administrators screw up SQL. Like if you guys had a list of, here's all the ways that you can screw SQL up, SharePoint administrators have done them all and maybe invented a couple of new ones. And the logging DB is one of them. And guys had a list of, here's all the ways that you can screw SQL up, SharePoint administrators have done them all and maybe invented a couple of new ones. And the logging DB is one of them. And the logging DB came from a good place. Mm-hmm. I say this tongue in cheek, but the underlying SQL structure for SharePoint is incredibly rigid and incredibly fragile. And so from day one, when SharePoint sat on top of SQL, Microsoft said, keep your hands out of SQL.
Yes.
Don't write to those databases. Don't read from those databases. Don't even look at those databases. Pretend they aren't there. And that was because there's not a lot of referential integrity. And so SharePoint assumes that things are a certain way inside of SQL. So administrators said, well, that's great and all, but there's a bunch of really good information in there that I would like to have. It's the only place that it exists. And you yell at me and slap my hand with the ruler if I read from it. So let's figure something out. So Microsoft, I think in SharePoint 2010, introduced this logging database where they just threw everything that anybody would ever want in that database, and they said, go watch this database and this database only. So you're right, that thing can get huge, and depending on what kind of recovery model you're using, the database can get big, the logs can get big, and most SharePoint administrators, if they installed SQL at all, if they had any portion of that, any of that work at all, once they do that, they forget about it. And so they don't think to monitor those drives and look at the logs and all that. And that database has taken down many a SharePoint farm because it fills up all the drives and just takes everything down. So you're absolutely right. That's one that the DBAs need to keep track of. That's one that SharePoint administrators probably should keep track of too, but they don't.
Sure.
So are there like standards or best practices out there for how to go about cleaning that logging database up or purging old data out of it or anything? Or
I'm not sure if there's any official ones. Microsoft's stance on it is you can do whatever you want. So you can delete it, rename it, do whatever things that you want to do to it, you can, because they don't read for anything, so they don't care.
Sure. Well, now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the default is that there's no expiration or there's no kind of archiving there. Going in and setting that would be like a good first step, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that Microsoft, at least the SharePoint team, has done is, and I can't think of any exceptions to this, though I'm sure there are, but anytime there is a fork in the road and one answer means that something might get removed and the other answer is it won't, they always go to the do no harm.
Right.
So things like, it would be great to auto archive after 30 days because that would save disk space and all that. But they're like, no, I don't want to delete anything. You never know when somebody's going to need something from 31 days ago, when the most important spreadsheet ever got deleted or something. So they let that stuff run wild. So I think, that's an important first step to figuring out, if you've got a data warehouse somewhere you're going to keep these things in, or if you're just going to set up your policies to say we can't look back any farther than 60 days or 90 days.
Right.
That's definitely something the SharePoint administrators should figure out early is how to handle that database.
And shame on us, I guess if there's a database administrator there for having those drives fill up, right? You think is part of the core of what the SQL Server or the SQL Server database administrator's responsibilities are beyond backups is kind of keeping the system up, and knowing how much drive space you have, I think kind of is critical to that.
I couldn't agree more. Shame on you, DBAs. This is not the SharePoint administrator's fault whatsoever. We are collateral damage. Absolutely. No, I think part of that comes from the fact that DBAs have an idea on what their roles are.
Sure.
And you cover some of the basic stuff, backups and monitoring, things like that. But optimization, figuring out the way to get the best performance out of the databases and the procs and all those kind of things, that's just something that every DBA does. And they go into every situation expecting to provide that service.
Right.
And then the SharePoint guys come to provide that service.
Right.
And then the SharePoint guys come along.
Yeah.
And they're and for the longest time, SharePoint was the sexy beast out there. The SharePoint guys walked in, they had a swagger about them. It was just obnoxious. And I say that as a SharePoint guy that had that swagger about you. And so we come in and we're like, SQL guys, that's adorable that you think you can help, but don't touch anything.
Yeah, right.
Don't look at anything. Don't change your box. I know that you think you're smart, but don't touch anything. And after that happens to the DBAs a couple of times, they're like, fine, you told us not to touch anything. Well, then we're not going to touch anything.
That's right.
And so they're in this weird. Yeah. I'm going to go back to playing solitaire at my desk. So that's how kind of this dynamic thing got worked out. Neither side really understood the other side very well. And the SQL guys were told to keep their hands off, and a lot of them did. I do have one funny story with a customer. They did have a SQL team, a SharePoint team, and SharePoint was running fine. And then all of a sudden, things started breaking. Oh, we didn't change anything. Talked to one SQL DBA who had a stroke of honesty about him. He's like, "Yeah, I was playing with the public role a little bit, and I took a bunch of things out. Is that bad? Is that wrong?"
Ouch.
Well, yeah, it was. And in his defense, that industry was a very secure industry, and that was just his job, was to make sure that nothing had permission that it didn't need to have. And he didn't know for sure, and he was trying to do the right thing. And we're like, yeah, don't touch that, bad DBA. That kind of stuff happens all the time. So I agree the DBA should keep their eye on that kind of stuff, but there's a lot of things going on. And there's not always a DBA out there. You might have real SQL things to worry about, and that SharePoint might have gotten stood up someplace where you didn't know about, kind of off the record there, and that kind of stuff happens.
So as the DBA, oftentimes we're put in the position where we're responsible for that server, but then we're told, don't touch it, don't change it. And then things happen like databases get server, but then we're told, don't touch it, don't change it. And then things happen like databases get big because of a lot of logging. And what do? I mean, we can't touch it, we can't change it, but we're running out of disk space. Do we just throw an unlimited amount of disk space at it, or and more memory, or
all of the above. Yeah, I keep hearing about how cheap disk space is. I hear that from people all the time. When I was a server admin, they're like, why does it cost so much for server space? I can go to Best Buy and buy it. To be a server admin again. So a couple of things. So Microsoft has some documentation that kind of helps with that, and I can give you guys the links to that. The SharePoint product team understands the tough position that DBAs are put in, so they have hard guidance on here's the things that you can do to secure and harden SQL. Here are the things that you can and can't touch in SQL to give you guys sort of a framework on things that you can do.
Okay.
And so I'll get you the links for those. Listeners, those will be in the show notes of these guys. For instance, when you create your SharePoint farm, and out of the box, I forget what it is now, but there's like 19 databases that get created with just a regular run-of-the-mill SharePoint farm. SQL or SharePoint makes some really bad assumptions about how things should be configured. For instance, it doesn't understand putting databases on different drives. It doesn't do that automatically. And it sets your recovery model to simple. All these kind of things. So as a DBA, you can't assume that things were set up in a way that makes sense because SharePoint doesn't always do that. So one of the things that you can do is go in and look at the recovery model and say, okay, we don't need, or the full, it sets them up with a full recovery model. You probably don't need that unless, you're probably doing some other kind of smart backups and truncating your logs and doing all these things. SharePoint doesn't necessarily do that correctly. It's going to put everything on whatever the default data drive is, the default log drive is, and there's obviously some databases that you can move around that make sense. Put them on different tiers of space and different sizes. Doing all these things. SharePoint doesn't necessarily do that correctly. It's going to put everything on whatever the default data drive is, the default log drive is, and there's obviously some databases that you can move around that make sense. Put them on different tiers of space and different sizes. So there's some of those things. Really looking at the documentation and finding out is the best way to do it. One of the things that I've talked about when I speak to SharePoint administrators is I don't expect them to be SQL experts. There's just not enough time in the day to be a SharePoint expert and a SQL expert. And so they should know a few things. They should know some of the vocabulary. They should know some of the terms so that when they come to you guys or when you guys come to them, that you can kind of speak on the same things. So if you come to somebody and say, hey, these drives are getting full, what can we do? There's situations where content databases can have huge amounts of white space in them. And so then you need to have a conversation. Should we shrink this database? Should we not shrink this database? Things like that. So it's kind of a two-way deal.
So even in that default setting, Todd, you talked about simple console. Is that changed at all?
So that is kind of true. And let me go back and say that by default, SharePoint creates the databases with the full recovery model,
right?
And not simple, because full is the one that fills up the hard drives and makes everything crash. But if you can tweak your model settings and play with that. But if you don't know enough to, if you're a SharePoint guy and don't know enough, that can bite you. As for databases, with the exception of one database, for the most part, all of the databases inside of SharePoint are portable. What it comes down to is knowing what kind of database it is and what you're trying to do with it. So the one that you really can't touch is the config database, and that is the one that has all of the farm-specific and machine-specific settings in it. You can't move that thing. You can't move it from farm to farm. You can't really even move it from location to location inside of SQL. It's just a very fussy thing. There's a lot of hard-coded things in there. And that's the one that bootstraps all the SharePoint servers. So something's wrong with that database, SharePoint can't start. Outside of that thing, there's a lot of hard-coded things in there. And that's the one that bootstraps all the SharePoint servers. So something's wrong with that database, SharePoint can't start. Outside of that, though, like your content databases where all your documents and your lists and all that, those things are completely portable to the point where I tell folks, when I'm talking to SharePoint folks, if you do nothing inside of SQL, get SQL-level backups of your content databases. Because if everything burns down, if your SharePoint servers explode and your SQL servers explode, if you've got copies of those databases, I can make sure you don't get fired because that's where all the stuff's at. I've got this great story. I used to work at a company and I left, and like 10 years later, the guy that was my boss calls me on a Friday night at 6 o'clock. I'm like, hey, Don, how's it going? been a while. And he's like, well, we've got this big SharePoint environment, and we're moving it to a hosting company. And we get everything set up, and we had all these VMs, all these hypervisors, and all these SharePoint farms. And the hosting company did a reverse migration. Now, I'd never heard the term reverse migration, but I think I had a pretty good idea what had happened. When they were set to copy their local, virtual machines and databases and all that to the hosting provider did it backwards and copied the blank environment over top of their production environment.
Oh, man.
Wow.
Yeah, so it gets worse, as if that was even possible. So he's telling me this story. He's like, okay, so we talked to our SQL team. They had databases. They had all the databases backed up. The SQL team rocked. Everything's good to go.
Woo-hoo.
He's like, so yeah, go DBAs.
Yeah.
And he's like, so I talked to the Windows team, and I said, okay, we need to restore all the VMs. And the Windows team said, we don't take care of that. The virtualization team does. He said, okay. So we went to the virtualization team, and he said, hey, I need to restore all these Windows VMs. And the virtualization team said, we don't do that. The Windows team does. So this guy was in this situation where he had I think 9 SharePoint farms and close to 30 SharePoint servers. And all of the servers, all of the Windows images were gone. All he had was the SQL images of the databases. That's all he had.
Wow.
And so I was able to take nothing but the SQL images, the SQL databases, after the SQL team rebuilt the SQL servers and mounted everything, and I brought all of that up in about a day and a half. Full fidelity, everything that he had the week before. Because all of the good stuff, all the important stuff is in SQL. All of the data is in SQL. And the fact that they had just SQL backups, they didn't have any SharePoint aware backups. The fact that they had good SQL backups, I was able to rebuild everything, bolt it all back together, and as far as I know, he didn't get fired. Where the SharePoint part comes in is there are a bunch of SharePoint pieces that aren't in SQL. And so if you don't do SharePoint aware backups, those things don't get backed up. And there's also units of scale inside of SharePoint. And a content data, they can have one or more site collections, which is kind of the unit of scale inside of SharePoint. Mm-hmm. So SQL can't back up anything but databases. But if you do SharePoint level backups, you can back up individual site collections and do some funny business there.
Gotcha.
But SQL backups are the very first thing I tell anybody to do.
There you go. So compañeros, there you go. If you're getting pushed out of the SharePoint love, right, make sure you're still taking your backups, because so then one day you too can be the hero.
Yes. Recover from a reverse migration.
Yeah. Oh, man. So one other thing I was going to ask about in the database itself, there are some settings that kind of drive us bonkers, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that it doesn't want us doing is creating statistics. So you have these very wide tables of all these lists, right? Column 1, column 2, just these data types. And, we look at it and we go crazy. And then it's like, okay, now you're not going to let me on column 2, just these data types. And, we look at it and we go crazy. And then it's like, okay, now you're not going to let me choose, create statistics that the database itself is going to create. I'm not going to create any on my own. I'm going to let the database create it. And SharePoint's like, no, don't do that. And
don't touch that.
Where you get in trouble, particularly, even if you decide to go and to do it, is then when you want to upgrade, it'll say, you've touched my database. I'm not going to let you upgrade. Right?
Yeah.
So my question is, creating automatic statistics, is that still a no-no? Is that something that we can turn on? And then if, again, assuming that we know enough and then we just remove them before upgrade time, what's your choice there? What side are you coming down on?
So I think that is covered in the best practices document that I promised that I would link to you guys. So the upgrade, the database stuff, I'm not sure if that particular one still gets caught or not. These days, when you upgrade SharePoint, it does. So all you can do is database attach. So you basically, you build a new SharePoint farm. If you've got SharePoint 2013 databases, you build your SharePoint 2016 farm. There is a commandlet that you can use to test the database, and it will tell you all the things that you've done wrong and all the things that it doesn't like. But more importantly, it will tell you whether that particular thing will block the upgrade or not. And there are precious few things that will actually block an upgrade. Now, playing with the database schema, that might be one of those things, but I don't remember if the statistics one, if it just yells at you or if it blocks the upgrade or not anymore. I know when going from SharePoint 2007 to 2010, it was super mean about those kind of things.
Right. Sensitive.
I don't know if that's still the case or not. And let me open up that best practices thing. I think it's in there. But yeah, you're right. And that's why I feel for the DBAs, because there are so many things that you guys do to keep things, and says don't do that. Now I'm looking at the best practices doc right now, and it says do not enable auto-create statistics on SharePoint content databases. We will find you. We will pull your fingernails out and put cockroaches in your underwear drawer. That seems unnecessary. I don't know why they do that. So yeah, don't do that particular thing. Now that is the SharePoint 2013 best practices document.
Right.
Check 2016 because the 2013 one.
So you would still be, you still follow that as a best practice then.
And I'm sure your listeners are used to talking about things that Microsoft supports, and there's supports with a capital S and supports with a lowercase s.
Sure.
And depending on what you're talking about, there are different levels of what you can and can't do. I've absolutely done things that I know that Microsoft hates, but they can't necessarily catch me at, and I've got plausible deniability. If this is one I don't know enough about SQL to know if there's a way you could turn that on, and I've got plausible deniability. If this is one I don't know enough about SQL to know if there's a way you could turn that on, and then if something goes haywire, you call Microsoft support, and they notice that if you could turn it off and undo any potential damage. I don't know that one well enough to comment on.
Then when we're looking at the SQL Server best practices or the normal things that we're doing for performance tuning, and then you compare that to what SharePoint's going to allow you to do, what are the kind of things that we should avoid or that we get into trouble if we do, or what are the things that we can do and get away with and work well?
Yeah, SharePoint's kind of like that pretty girl in high school. She's really pretty and you want to be seen with her, but man, is she a lot of work and man, is she demanding. SharePoint is kind of like that when it comes to SQL. So I'll refer you again back to that best practices document that I'm going to link and you're going to link and we're all going to link, that walks you through basically that question. As a well-seasoned A, you've got a list of things in your head that you want to do, and here's the list of the things that you can do, which is very short, and then here's a list of all the things that you cannot do. That really guides you. So a couple of things that we've talked about, you can't muck with things like indexes and fill factor and those kind of things. There are some hardening things that you can't do. I know one of the ones I think we talked about, you can't auto-create statistics. That's a big no-no. A gigantic no-no is you can't mess with the maximum degree of parallelization, or maxed out to its friends. That has to be set to 1 and only 1, or SharePoint 2013 and greater will just, depending on when it catches you changing that, it will just fall down and throw up its hands and refuse to serve anything up to you at all. It'll take its ball and it'll go home. And yeah, so if you don't have maxed out set to 1 on your instance when you create your farm, SharePoint will refuse to create the farm. It just won't do it. And then there are different your farm. SharePoint will refuse to create the farm. It just won't do it. And then there are different processes, maintenance processes and stuff that will check for that. So if you try to change it afterwards, they will get very angry with you. And while that's obnoxious, it is less obnoxious than it not checking and not getting angry with you and then corrupting your data because it thinks everything's running in one thread and it's not. So that I send that best practices document out to SQL DBAs all the time. It normally brings them to tears.
That's right.
Stuff that they can't do.
Right.
But Microsoft has done a pretty good job because this question comes up all the time. Yep. SQL DBAs have been around way longer than SharePoint administrators have. So you guys, you've honed your craft a lot better than we have. We had to provide you with this information.
Sure, and we just don't have that cool swagger that you mentioned earlier.
It's true. I mean, I've met some of the coolest SQL folks, and you got nothing on some of the coolest SharePoint folks.
Oh, man.
It's a true story.
Entered the conversation here.
It just got chilly. So it was funny, many years ago. So I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I have been for 10 or 11 years. And on one of the flights out to the MVP summit, I was sitting next to Tom LaRock. I don't know if you guys have dealt with him.
Yep.
And I do mean deal with him, not meet him. He's a special individual. But so on that plane, it's all nerds. It just that plane ride out to Seattle just had the stench of nerd about it. I'm sitting next to Tom, and he pulls out his laptop and he starts doing SQL things. And so I'm like, all right, he's probably an MVP. And I start talking to him. And to this day, I mean, this was probably 10 years ago, Tom and I still talk all the time because when that conversation started up, I'm like, hey, you're a SQL guy. He's like, yeah. I'm like, I'm a SharePoint guy. And he kind of looked at me And he gave me the stink eye. And I'm like, no, it's cool. I'm on your side. Tell me what I can do as a SharePoint guy to make SQL better. Help me understand the performance things that I can do. And we kind of bonded over that. So the amount of, we can mix the chocolate and the peanut butter. It works out.
There you go. So on the reverse side there, how are we driving our SharePoint admins crazy, and how can we, do a little bit more kumbaya singing and a little less yelling?
Yeah, well, I think there's a bunch of stuff you guys can do, and a bunch of stuff that SharePoint people don't understand. SharePoint administrators, everything in SharePoint is the content to them. It's the Word docs, it's the Excel spreadsheets, that they are laser focused on that. They can't see anything else. And as a DBA, you understand that by the time a piece of data ends up in a content database, it's probably gone through TempDB, it's sat in a log file for a while. There are a bunch of things that happen before it gets in that database. Whereas to us SharePoint admins, it goes from my mom's computer to the screen directly into that SQL database, no stops between.
Right.
So one of the things that you guys can do is on the back end, think about where databases go, what spindles, of course you can't really call them spindles anymore, but sure, which drives TempDB goes on, how many TempDBs to have, where to put the logs, where to put the databases, things like that to make SharePoint shine. That's one of the things, and educate those SharePoint folks on that and why you're doing it, and help them understand the value of that. That makes so much difference. Making sure that your SQL servers have enough memory, have enough RAM to do the things that they need to do. And there's some guidance on that out there. But again, you guys, you again, it's almost more art than science at this point. You guys can feel those things out, and you understand the different metrics to look at and see where SharePoint's kind of fallen down, and help guide those folks that way.
Yep. So on that point then around moving data and log files around, I mean, generally we see with SQL databases that if you can have your log files on a different drive, whatever,
Yeah.
One of the things I've run into with SharePoint admins in that area is that you make recommendations and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to put in a new drive. We're going to move the log files over here, or we're going to move the data files or whatever. And there's a lot of pushback saying, oh, you can't do that with SharePoint.
You can't touch it.
That'll invalidate the warranty and the entire system will blow up.
Yeah, I think that comes from two things. I think one of the things is SharePoint administrators are very sure of themselves. Yeah, I think that comes from two things. I think one of the things is SharePoint administrators are very sure of themselves, and so they have heard that you shouldn't touch things in SQL, and so they repeat that with great authority and feeling. And the other thing is, I think most SharePoint administrators are scared to death of SQL. I mean, just terrified of it. And so they're afraid, if you go back there and fiddle some bits, that it might just kill SharePoint and SharePoint will never recover. And so I think it's equal parts those two things. SharePoint absolutely is fine with the transaction logs and databases being on separate drives. It's absolutely fine with, if you've got a content database that has really fast growing logs and you need to move those, it's fine with taking that database offline in SharePoint, which is different than dropping it in SQL. The way SharePoint uses offline for databases is maddening. But it absolutely understands that, moving the logs or backing it up and restoring it and splitting,
There. So I go to my admin and I say, we need to make a change here. We've gotten to a point where they would trust me and I'm not going to break everything. Am I using SharePoint to take the database offline, or can I do that through SQL Server or Management Studio and take the database offline and move the files around?
Yes. So it depends on the database and what you're doing on the SQL backend.
Okay.
So the content databases and the content databases alone have this idea of being offline and detached and things like that. With a content database in SharePoint, if you set it to offline, what that does not mean is that it's not accessible to SharePoint. The way offline means in every other corner of the tech world, every time, ever, except that one instance. And to make it even more confusing, there are two screens that's on in one place, that one instance. And to make it even more confusing, there are two screens that's on in one place. The options are offline and ready for a database, a content database. In the other screen, the options are stopped and started.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And it's the same setting. And it's been that way for 10 years. I mean, it's been that way for like 10 versions of SharePoint. So as a DBA, you hear the database is offline, and you're like, hey, the database is offline. When SharePoint expects to be able to see it, what it means for SharePoint is I can't create new site collections there, is what that means. So with content databases, you can detach them, and then SharePoint doesn't look for them anymore. And then what they're doing in SQL doesn't matter. You can do whatever. You can have different file groups and things like that for databases. And depending on what you're doing on the back end, you may be able to move those transaction logs and create another log on a different drive. SQL does its thing and tries to balance things, and you can move things that way. As long as that database is accessible, SharePoint doesn't care. They're the ones that are going to get really big.
Right.
Say, detach this in SharePoint so it doesn't show up. You're going to have a little bit of downtime, but that's okay. And then, take your transaction log, move it, add the database back in. Yeah, SharePoint doesn't care about that.
Well, they shouldn't be getting that big anymore, because now we have permission to go in and take the backups of the databases. And so we'll help manage the size from that perspective.
Yeah. And that's, so I don't know how many hours I've spent with SharePoint admins where when I was consulting, they would call up and say, hey, SharePoint's down, everything's ruined. And it would be because the transaction log file was, had eaten. Yep. My favorite one, and this was like in 2008. I mean, we're talking almost 10 years ago. And a guy calls up all freaked out, SharePoint's down. I imagine him running around his office, waving his hands in the air. His hair was on fire, that whole deal.
Sure.
And so I jump on there. Sure enough, it's another one of those farms that a gigantic transaction log had taken down. And this transaction log was 350, waving his hands in the air. His hair was on fire, that whole deal.
Sure.
And so I jump on there. Sure enough, it's another one of those farms that a gigantic transaction log had taken down. And this transaction log was 350 gigs, something like that. And I don't know how big transaction logs, I don't know what you guys are used to seeing these days, but back in 2008, 2009, that was a pretty big file. So I walk in with my typical SharePoint swagger. I'm like, don't worry about this, man. I got this. I clean this up all the time. And I went in, changed it from full to simple, and I know in the background that the database engine's going through and marking transactions and all that. So I wait a little bit. I'm making some chit chat with the guy. And a couple minutes later, I go through and I try to shrink the transaction log. And I told him what this process is going to be. It only shrunk it by like 20 gig, which 20 gig, normally that's a huge, but this guy's seen his 350 gig file. Now it's a 330 gig file. And he's freaking out. But it just goes to show he didn't understand the back end of SQL. He understood SharePoint. And I'm like, we got a lot going on here. Database engine's working as fast as it can. It's all good. Sure. That kind of stuff happened all the time. Another fun one that I had was I was working with a customer. We were going to test a migration. And, we talked earlier in this podcast about databases being portable. And if you just do SQL level database backups, you're fine. So I jump on his SQL box and I make backups of all of his databases. And I look at the SQL box and it's got, the amount of space I need times 1.5 free. I'm like, all right, I got plenty of time. So him and I start running the backups, and all of a sudden his RDP session shuts down. And he's like, well, is the backup still going? I'm like, well, that depends a lot on why RDP went away now, doesn't it? If it's because your connection to the server went away, probably still going on. If it's because the server burst into flames, probably not. So he tries to connect and he can't get connected. And he's like, well, I don't know what's going on. And then he gets a knock at his door and everything is down. Email's down, the whole thing. And he's like, oh, it sounds like our hypervisor went down. Okay. So he does some investigation. They had been thin provisioning their drives. And I started these, multi-gigabyte backups and filled up the drive on the hypervisor. Everything paused. Okay, good enough. So he goes through, he removes some stuff. A couple minutes later, we're back up and going. We jump back on the server. Of course, the backups didn't finish because the machine shut down. And I start the backups again. We get about 10% in. His RDP session goes away again. And I'm like, I feel like I've taken your farm down about as many times today as I want to. I'm like, I think you need to figure out some space for this. I can't keep taking your whole company down like this. I feel bad.
Wow.
But that's another one of those things. And then I remember back in those days when I would speak at things like a SharePoint conference, I would tell people, don't virtualize SQL. Just don't do it. There's, there's a performance penalty, and there's all these other things. But that was one of those things back then. I'm like, this is just another reason not to virtualize SQL. Got to have that drive space. Got to have good I/O.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if you don't have drive space, you don't have too much.
No, that was another one.
Especially if you want to add something to it, right? I guess if you want it to be read only, that's one thing. But
yeah, that was. I keep taking your farm down, and I feel bad about it.
Yeah. All right. Well, some great information there, I think, for the SQL DBAs as well as the SharePoint people.
Yeah, I guess I do have one other thing I want to bring up to DBAs, and this is the story of SQL aliases. And do you guys use SQL aliases much?
Not often.
Okay. That is a debate inside of the SharePoint community a lot. And the way that I feel, and again, it's not, my information on this is dated, but I first started touching SQL aliases probably in 2008, 2009, and it was like black magic to me. I mean, it was like I remember the first time I ever pulled a hard drive out of a RAID file, 2009, and it was like black magic to me. I mean, I remember the first time I ever pulled a hard drive out of a RAID 5 and everything kept working. I'm like, there's a camera somewhere. This is black magic. There's no way this works. I felt the same way about the first time I used a SQL alias. And once word got out that those were there, people were like, oh, we should use SQL aliases all the time. But for the longest time, when I would get up in front of a room, speaking to SharePoint admins, I would say, who here knows what a SQL alias is? And like 3 people out of 50 or 100 would raise their hand. And I would say, this is why you shouldn't use a SQL alias. Because SQL aliases work so well that if you don't know what you're looking for, you'll never find it. You'll never know why things don't work. And so my guidance to folks has always been not to use a SQL alias unless you need it. Unless you can articulate the reason why you need to use a SQL alias, don't bother with it. Because you're going to go on in your career, hopefully get a big promotion or win the lottery or whatever.
Yeah, it's one of those things I think of, like, as people are migrating, right? So they want to go from server A to server B, then they'll introduce that alias. But I kind of feel like, just bite the bullet and get that SharePoint setting reset, like change your applications, right? Unless it's going to really be that difficult, it's worth not using the alias, because you're then kind of giving control, if you will, to like who owns that, right? Whereas with like even DNS, there's an owner, right? Like where that is going from, and you don't quite have that with an alias. So I think that's the kind of the tricky part there.
Yeah, well, there is one very specific reason to use aliases with SharePoint. Well, there's 2, but it's for the same reason. We talked earlier about that config database. SharePoint does not support moving that config database, period. And so if you have to move servers or migrate or something, there is no supported way to move where that config database is. So if you want to move it, you have to use an alias. There's just no way around it. Talked earlier about that config database. SharePoint does not support moving that config database, period. And so if you have to move servers or migrate or something, there is no supported way to move where that config database is. So if you want to move it, you have to use an alias. There's just no way around it. And
okay. Yeah. So you have to. Okay.
Yeah, you have to. And the other thing is if you're using any kind of non-standard ports, because you can't do anything with non-standard ports with DNS. Everything, because that's just the host name level thing. With aliases, you can.
Right.
So that's the 2 reasons that I tell people, and again, it's very valid. And if you're doing one of those 2 things, rock on, use an alias. But the thing that I tell people is there's no benefit to using the alias when you build the farm. You can always drop it in later.
Right.
And so, because aliases, I'm telling you, still today, I bet half of the SharePoint administrators don't know what an alias is, or know where to find it, or know where to configure it, or know that there's 2 of them. I tell people to be afraid. It's like fire or gunpowder. Have a healthy respect for it. It's a good tool, but don't play with it. Good way to lose a finger.
Yep. Very good advice. So shall we go into the SQL family questions now?
Sure.
So can you tell us how you first got started with SQL Server and or SharePoint?
Yeah. So I got my first SQL Server cert in December of 1997. I got my administrating SQL 6.5 certification back then. And it was one of those things. I worked for a company that used a little piece of accounting software. Maybe you've heard of it, Great Plains Dynamics. And this was way before Microsoft purchased them. And the company that I worked for was a consulting company, and they wanted to use Dynamics, but it was really expensive to buy. But what they found was that if you were a Great Plains reseller, you got to use it for free. And so everybody, we're going to become a Great Plains reseller. And to get that, you had to have somebody who was certified on their software. And that person, if they went the Microsoft route, because that stuff also ran on Novell, you had to be an MCSE and you had to be certified in SQL. And then you could go to this class. And I was already an MCSE, and they said, "Congratulations, Todd, you're about to become a SQL administrator. Go pass this test because you're going to Fargo next month." That was how I got started with SQL, 20 years ago now. And then for SharePoint, my introduction to being a SharePoint administrator was very similar. I was a server admin at the time. This was like 2002, and Windows, Exchange, that kind of stuff. And my boss told me to set up a web page that had all of our servers worldwide, model numbers, serial numbers, warranty dates, all that, and put it up on a web page so everybody could get to it. And I can't program, I can't design web pages, I can't match my clothes, for God's sakes. And so I looked at this task and I'm like, well, I got my resume, so that's good. I'm on the web page, I can't match my clothes, for God's sakes. And so I looked at this task and I'm like, well, I got my resume, so that's good. I'm gonna need that. And then I was drinking some coffee, and I had the Office XP CD that had a trial thing of SharePoint Team Services 2001. And I'm like, I remember seeing something about this at MEC, and I installed it and put this database out there and had all that up there, and I was hailed as a hero, and it was all great. And then our company decided that we were going to write some software that sat on top of SharePoint 2003 when it came out. And my boss said, "SharePoint? Well, I've got a SharePoint guy." And that was the day I became the SharePoint guy.
That's when the enter swag, right?
Exactly. I stood up a little straighter, shoulders a little back.
Wow, nice.
Yep.
Now, if you could change one thing about SQL Server, what would it be?
Boy, there's a lot over these. I haven't played with the SQL 2016 PowerShell stuff as much, but I know with the previous versions, the PowerShell was, shall we say, odd. As a guy that uses PowerShell for Windows and for SharePoint and for Office 365, the SQL PowerShell seemed to dance to its own beat a little bit. So that's one of the things. I think for the most part, SQL is a really mature product, and they've made a lot of mistakes, but they made them a long time ago. So some of the stuff maybe around, I don't know, some of the SharePoint specific stuff, database sizing, the recovery models and things like that. One thing that always gets me, for whatever reason, the way I think the security piece is backwards. In my head, if I want to give a user permission to a database, that should be a function of the database, but it's not. It's a function of the user. I have to go into security, find the user, and give them an access to the database. In my head, in SharePoint, we have to do that. And then because of that, the security stuff is in the master database, and not with the databases I guess it does come into the backups. But just little things like that. But for the most part, as a SharePoint admin, SQL's treated me fairly well. Again, like fire and gunpowder, I have a healthy respect for it, but it's been pretty good to me.
Okay, so what is the best piece of career advice that you've received?
Professional football's not for you. Maybe you should be a computer nerd. I think that was probably pretty good career advice.
Professional football an actual option at some point?
No, not even a little. I was a nerd from the day I was born, and back in high school, wasn't real cool. Spent a lot of time hiding in my locker. Spent a lot of time wondering why girls wouldn't talk to me, things like that. Turns out being a nerd worked out for me. I think as I look back now, it's kind of cool to be a nerd. So no, sports was never a real option for me at all. I think I've had a couple of them. One of them is something we talked about before we went on the air, was just it's all about people. It's all about networking. It's all about who you know, and not in a nepotism sort of way, but it's all about who you have relationships with. So never burn bridges. Never, always give the other person the benefit of the doubt. One thing that I found over the years is anytime I have this idea, who's the idiot who thought of that? The answer to that question is usually a well-intentioned, smart person who just sees things that you haven't thought about yet. And it humanizes some of these dumb decisions that you see people make, because they see other aspects of the problem that you haven't seen. And so, give other people the benefit of the doubt. It's all about other people. Another piece of advice that I got was about 5 years ago when I started working for Rackspace. I was part of an acquisition, and I was a remote worker. So I wasn't in San Antonio. For Rackspace, I was part of an acquisition, and I was a remote worker. So I wasn't in San Antonio. I wasn't with everybody else. And I was like my first review. I had my goals and I didn't get them all done. And I'm talking to my boss. He's like, how come you didn't get all this stuff done? And I'm like, well, I'm not in the office and this guy wouldn't call me back and I couldn't get a hold of this guy. And remote workers, they just get no respect. And he's like, yeah, that's the truth. Every bit of that's true. Figure it out. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, you got to try harder. I don't care about what they're doing. I care about what you're doing. Yep, all those obstacles are in your way. Figure it out. Make it happen. And I'm like, well, that's kind of not helpful. but it was absolutely the advice that I needed. You just got to go through. Yep, bad things happen. Stuff's unfair. You just got to, how you handle it is the key. So that's, and that guy just wasn't very empathetic. He was kind of a jerk, but, it was good advice.
Yeah. All right.
Todd, our last question for you today. If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
So it's funny, I was asked this question a few years ago, and for my superhero power, I want to be on.
Wow, I think you're the first person on the show who's had that aspiration.
and so I think it's self-explanatory is why I want it. It gets me on shows like this. It's a superhero power. I watch a lot of sci-fi, and I found that almost every superhero power comes with a really bad negative side effect. And I just don't think I have the morals to have any of those powers and use them for good. So I think, I don't know, maybe the superpower would be always knowing whether I'd left the toilet seat up or not, so that I would know that I need to put that down. Maybe something like that, because I swear to God, I'd screw up any superpower I had. I would not. I can't be trusted with superpowers.
Not do well.
No.
Okay, so we can trust you with our SharePoint, but we won't trust you with powers.
But not an inch farther. Yeah, that is it. Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been great information, Todd. I've learned.
No.
Okay, so we can trust you with our SharePoint, but we won't trust you with powers.
But not an inch farther. Yeah, that is it. Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been great information, Todd. I've learned a lot during this episode.
Yeah.
I'm glad. I think there's not enough done to get our communities together. I think the SQL communities and the SharePoint communities, they need to understand each other a little better. I think that would be a good thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, awesome. Yeah. Thanks again for being in with us today.
Yeah, and if any of your SQL folks have questions or whatever, I've got a blog at toddklindt.com, and I'm on Twitter at Todd Klindt. Not very imaginative with my names, obviously. But yeah, tell your folks to reach out to me. I'm happy to hear from anybody.
Awesome. So there you go, Steve. I think my big takeaway there was, even though we don't get to do some of the things that we want to do, Microsoft has kind of prohibited us, right? For lack of a better word.
And I think really the key with that is understanding what you can do and what you shouldn't do. And knowing what falls into that, don't touch it because it's SharePoint, and the things that are safe to change. And I think we got a bit of that in the conversation with Todd, and I think that he had a bunch of information that he mentioned available, I think, on his blog as well, that we could follow up on and get more information on that.
Right. It kind of goes back to that idea of knowing your application, right? And SharePoint, because it's a Microsoft product, has some specific requirements around it. But even with things that we might deem quote unquote best practices or, SQL best practices from a community perspective, again, we have to know our applications and understand how these things are going to affect ultimately the users that we're trying to serve.
Yes, indeed. And I think that with that, just because it's a standard SQL best practice doesn't always mean it's going to be a SharePoint best practice. And we've seen that on many occasions.
That's right.
I think that with that, just because it's a standard SQL best practice doesn't always mean it's going to be a SharePoint best practice. And we've seen that on many occasions.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And sometimes bring a tear to your eye, but ultimately you want to help support your users, and that's going to do that by following what we've been told there. And I know you mentioned that, there has kind of been a lack of information potentially in the past as to what you should or shouldn't be doing, or maybe the whys behind it.
Yep.
So for example, that whole idea of the max degree of parallelism being set to 1. Todd brought up, it was kind of just in passing, but reading a little bit more about that the application behaves like there's only going to be one thread. And if there are multiple threads, then it could cause a problem.
Yep.
And, who would want to introduce that into their environment?
Right. And even though that goes against about tuning SQL Server, we just need to know that's one of those rules you need to follow in the case of SharePoint.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Our music for SQL Server in the news is by Mansardian, used under Creative Commons. So I think that's going to do it for us today. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. If you want to reach out to us, again, the show notes will be available at SQLDataPartners.com/SharePoint, or you can reach out to us on Twitter. I am at Carlos El Chacon.
And I am at SQL EMT. And we'll see you on the SQL Trail.